I thought this time would be different. I really did. But there I was again, broke, jobless, and stuck in the middle of nowhere, living in a house that felt like it had crawled straight out of some twisted nightmare. The last thing I ever wanted. It all started when I decided to make another attempt to leave the big city behind for good. I've always hated big cities, the noise, the chaos, the feeling of being surrounded yet completely alone. But every time I tried to escape, I'd end up crawling back, just to scrape by financially. This is an honest, true story about the haunted house I ended up in, and I swear, nothing could have prepared me for what I experienced there. The house was completely isolated from the rest of the world. The closest neighbor was over 5 kilometers away. It was early summer, and I was thrilled to finally be out of Sao Paulo again. I had managed to land a job as a radio technician in a tiny town about 30 kilometers from a nearly deserted valley where I hoped to live. I arrived at the radio station first thing when I got into town, went through introductions, and listened to what they expected from me. After that, I made my way to my favorite valley. Everything felt perfect at first. I had a few old friends in the area from when I'd lived there before, so I figured I could crash with them until I found a place of my own. But after just 2 weeks, things started to fall apart. The radio station decided they didn't need a full-time technician anymore. Still, I wasn't ready to give up. I was determined to find another job and stay in the region. I'd already checked out a bunch of rental houses, but none of them felt right. That's when I ran into an old friend, Beto, and his newlywed wife. He was also looking for a place to rent and had a few ideas I hadn't considered. He described a place that sounded almost too good to be true. A 2-story farmhouse with 6 bedrooms, barns, and stables. The house was about 15 kilometers from the nearest town, down a barely used dirt road. The rent? Just 75 Brazilian reals a month. The owner had slashed the price in exchange for some renovations, according to Beto. I was starting to get excited, until Beto's wife chimed in, casually mentioning that the house was haunted. Now, I didn't know her well. This was our first meeting, but neither of them struck me as superstitious. Still, I was skeptical. Maybe she just didn't like old houses that needed work. Either way, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to check out the place. The next day, Beto and I hopped on his old motorbike and made our way toward the farmhouse. The dirt road felt like it stretched on forever, winding through dense trees and overgrown fields. The further we got, the more isolated it felt. No signs of life, no other houses, just us and the endless road. When we finally pulled up, I felt my stomach twist. The house was enormous, much bigger than I'd imagined. But it wasn't just the size. It was the way it looked. The white paint was peeling off in long, jagged strips, and the windows stared out like hollow eyes. The roof sagged in places, and the front porch creaked in the wind, even though the air was still. But despite the eerie vibe, I couldn't ignore the potential. The rent was dirt cheap, and I needed a place. I figured a little hard work could bring the house back to life. Beto seemed unfazed by the house's condition, and his enthusiasm rubbed off on me. We explored the property together, checking out the barns and stables, which were just as run down as the house itself. As we stepped inside, the air changed. It was cooler, almost damp, and smelled like mold and something else I couldn't quite place. The house was fully furnished, but everything was coated in a thin layer of dust. The furniture was old, mismatched, and heavy, like it had been sitting there for decades. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every creak of the floorboards echoed through the empty rooms, and shadows seemed to move just out of the corner of my eye. But I told myself it was just my imagination. I was letting Beto's wife's comment about the house being haunted get into my head. We finished the tour, and despite the unease gnawing at the back of my mind, I agreed to move in. It was just an old house. I told myself, what's the worst that could happen? Turns out, I had no idea. Moving in took longer than I expected. The house had this stubborn, heavy feeling, like it didn't want to be disturbed. The first night I spent there, I barely slept. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, and every creak of the old wood sounded like footsteps. But I chalked it up to the house settling and my nerves being on edge. During the day, things felt normal enough. I unpacked my things, cleaned up the dust, and tried to make the place feel like home. But there were little things I couldn't ignore. My keys would disappear and then reappear in places I was sure I hadn't left them. Doors I'd closed would be wide open when I came back into the room. The lights would flicker, even though the wiring had been checked recently. I started hearing noises at night, soft whispers that seemed to come from the walls, faint scratching sounds above the ceiling. Sometimes, it felt like someone was standing just behind me. But when I turned around, no one was there. I tried to brush it off. Old houses make weird noises, right? But then there were the cold spots. Entire rooms would drop in temperature out of nowhere, even though it was the middle of summer. I'd wake up in the middle of the night shivering, even though the windows were closed and the blankets were piled on top of me. The worst part was the feeling of being watched. It wasn't just a passing sensation, it was constant. I'd be eating breakfast, and I'd feel eyes on me from the dark corners of the room. I started leaving lights on at night, but that only made the shadows seem deeper. I told myself I was being paranoid, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. This wasn't just an old, creaky house. There was something in it, and whatever it was, it wasn't happy I was there. It wasn't long before the strange occurrences escalated into something I couldn't ignore. One night, I was in bed, trying to convince myself the noises were just the house settling, when I heard something different. It was faint at first, like a soft humming, but it grew louder, turning into a low, guttural whisper that seemed to seep through the walls. I sat up, straining to hear. The voice wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the house. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and crept out of my bedroom. The hallway was pitch black, and the air felt thick, like it was pressing against my skin. I flicked on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. That's when I saw it. The door to the basement was wide open. I was certain I'd left it closed. The humming was louder now, coming from below. Against every instinct screaming in my head, I stepped closer, peering down the basement stairs. The light barely reached the bottom, but I could see someone standing there. It was a shadow, darker than the rest of the basement, with no distinct features. But I could feel its eyes on me, even though it had none. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to run, but my feet felt glued to the floor. Then, as if acknowledging my presence, the shadow moved. It glided up the steps without a sound, coming closer and closer. I slammed the door shut and bolted it, my hands trembling, so hard I could barely turn the lock. I backed away, heart racing, listening for any sound from the other side of the door. But there was nothing, just silence. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of my room, flashlight in hand, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. The next morning, when I finally worked up the courage to check, the basement door was still locked. But deep down, I knew that thing was still there, and it wasn't going to stop. After that night, everything changed. The house wasn't just strange anymore. It felt alive. And it wasn't just the creaks and whispers. It was like the house was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. Objects started moving on their own. I'd leave my keys on the kitchen counter, only to find them in the bathroom. Lights would flicker, even though the wiring was supposed to be new. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was just stressed or tired, but it became impossible to ignore. One evening, I was in the living room, trying to distract myself with a book. The TV turned on by itself, static blaring at full volume. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I grabbed the remote and turned it off. But as soon as I set it down, the TV switched back on. This time, it wasn't static. It was a distorted image, flickering and shifting, like something, or someone, was trying to break through the screen. I unplugged the TV, but the image stayed on the screen for a few seconds longer before finally fading out. My hands were shaking. I knew then that this wasn't just some faulty electronics. Something in that house was trying to communicate or torment me. But the worst part wasn't the noises or the moving objects. It was the feeling of being watched. No matter where I went in the house, I felt eyes on me, like I wasn't alone. I'd catch glimpses of figures out of the corner of my eye. But when I turned, nothing was there. One night, I woke up to find all the doors in the house wide open. Front door, back door, even the basement door. I know I locked them. It was like whatever was in the house was inviting something else in, or trying to lure me out. I started sleeping with a knife under my pillow. But even that didn't make me feel safe. The house wasn't just haunted, it was hostile, and I could feel it getting stronger. I hit my breaking point a week later. It was around 3 a.m., the classic witching hour cliché. I was lying in bed, eyes wide open, too scared to sleep, when I heard it, a slow, deliberate scratching sound coming from inside the walls. It wasn't mice. It wasn't the house settling. It was too purposeful, like fingernails dragging across wood. Then, the whispering started again. But this time, it wasn't distant. It was right next to my ear. "Get out." I bolted upright, heart pounding so loud I thought it might explode. The room was freezing, my breath visible in the dark. But what made my blood run cold wasn't the temperature. It was the figure standing at the foot of my bed. A tall, shadowy silhouette, darker than the dark around it. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, drilling into my soul. I wanted to scream, but my voice was stuck in my throat. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move, unable to look away. The figure took a step closer. The floorboards didn't creak under its weight, and then it spoke. A guttural, raspy voice that didn't sound human. "You shouldn't be here." That snapped me out of it. I scrambled out of bed, sprinted down the hall, and fled the house without looking back. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, locking the doors like that would somehow protect me. I spent the rest of the night in a gas station parking lot, trying to convince myself that I wasn't losing my mind. But deep down, I knew the truth. The house didn't want me there, and whatever was in that house, it was getting bolder. I didn't go back for days. I crashed at a friend's place, making up some excuse about renovations. But the house haunted me even when I wasn't in it. I couldn't shake the feeling that it knew I was avoiding it, that it was waiting for me to come back. But here's the thing. I couldn't just abandon it. Financially, I was tied to the place, and practically, all my stuff was still there. So, against every instinct screaming in my head, I decided to go back one last time. During the day, when I thought I'd be safe. Big mistake. When I pulled into the driveway, everything looked normal. Too normal. Like the house was pretending nothing had happened. But as soon as I stepped inside, the air felt heavy, suffocating. The sunlight streaming through the windows didn't make me feel any safer. I moved quickly, grabbing my essentials, trying not to think about the fact that I was completely alone in there. But just as I was about to leave, I noticed something. The attic door was open. I never opened the attic. Against my better judgment, I climbed the creaky stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The attic was dark, despite the daylight. I fumbled for the light pull, but when I tugged it, nothing happened. Then I saw it. In the far corner of the attic, there was something new. A small, old-fashioned wooden box I'd never seen before. It was covered in dust, but the latch looked freshly broken, like someone, or something, had forced it open. Curiosity got the better of me. I approached, feeling that same icy chill from before. Inside the box were a few old photographs, yellowed with age, and a bundle of letters tied with a red ribbon. The photos showed a family I didn't recognize, standing in front of my house, but their faces were wrong, blurry, like they didn't want to be remembered. The letters were worse. They were written in shaky handwriting, rambling about something in the house, something that wouldn't let them leave. The last letter ended mid-sentence. The ink smeared like the writer had been interrupted. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate. But when I turned around, the attic was empty. I ran. I didn't even bother to shut the door behind me. I just drove, not caring where I was going, as long as it was away from that house. But here's the thing. The story doesn't end there. Because sometimes, when I'm alone, I still hear the whispering. And I'm starting to think, maybe I didn't leave the house. Maybe it followed me. If you enjoyed this chilling story, don't forget to subscribe to Beyond Fear and hit the bell icon so you won't miss any of our upcoming videos. Here, you'll find more real stories filled with mystery, psychological horror, and the supernatural every week. Before you go, make sure to check out the 2 videos that just popped up in the end screen. I promise, they'll leave you with goosebumps. See you next time, if you dare.